Hi, everyone, and welcome to Creating a Story or Series Bible. I'm Leslye Penelope. I am a fantasy author, a podcaster, a YouTuber, and I love talking about story Bibles. I'm going to use the terms story and series Bible interchangeably, but we'll talk about what they each are in more detail in the presentation. You can learn more about me at my websites. lpenelope.com is my author website. I have a podcast and YouTube show called My Imaginary Friends, and you can learn more about that and my courses at myimaginaryfriends.net. So today we're going to be talking about story Bibles. We are going to go over what a story Bible even is, the elements of a story Bible, techniques and tools for creating them, and then tips, strategies, and maintenance, because they are the most useful when they are up to date and they have all of the information that you need in them. So that brings us to our first question. What is a story Bible? So a story Bible can be thought of as the canonical documentation of your characters, settings, objects, histories, and other elements in your fictional world. The actual title or the words story Bible, as far as I know, they come from the TV and film world. So when you work on a television show, when you create a television show, usually you have to pitch it and you come up with a series Bible for that. And that looks different for each creator, but it's going to have a little bit about the synopsis of what the show is about, the main characters. You might have sketches or other mock-ups of characters, scenes, settings, locations, and costumes, props, important things like that. So we take that idea and bring it to our stories. Whenever you're writing a novel or a series, you're going to need to know what's in it. You're going to need some sort of documentation of the canon for yourself, and then maybe for your fans, or if you sell the rights to a TV or film deal, those people, the producers, the writers, might need to know more information about your world, your characters, all of that stuff. So we use a story Bible to hold all the planning and the reference materials for your story or your book series. It's like your own personal Wikipedia. And there are lots of ways to do this. You can actually create your own wiki. Anything from a notebook, keeping it on pen and paper, dead tree media. It's not my preferred method, but we're going to talk more about that as we go on. So it's your own encyclopedia, or Wikipedia for the people who don't remember encyclopedias. If you're a little too young for that, think of it like that, your reference points. And it's going to help you as an author, even if no one else ever looks at it, which most of the time no one else will. But even if it's only for you, it'll be so helpful for you. Trust me on this. So, is this you? You are working on a multi-book series. You don't write particularly fast. I mean, there are some people out there writing a book a week, books a month, multiple books in a month. But that might not be you. It's not most of us. I don't think. It's definitely not me. Maybe it takes you more than a year to write a book. Over the course of several weeks, months, or years, you are going to forget things that happen in your own story that you are writing. You might want to write a sequel at some point in the future. Maybe you're going to write a sequel. Maybe you've already planned out your 12-book series. But even if it's just 1 or 2 books, or if you write a book that you intend to be a standalone and it's popular and people want more of it, you're going to come back and write a sequel, and you might still have to reread the books that came before this one or the next one. But having the story Bible will make it a lot easier. You're just a regular person with a regular memory who just loses track of details in your book. This happens a lot with animals, I've found, and you'll hear other authors talk about this too, where it's hard to keep track of an animal that doesn't have a lot to do. It's not like the plot doesn't surround, the dog, but there is a dog, and I have dogs and cats, and I want to sometimes put them in books, but they tend to wander off, and then you get to the epilogue, you're like, oh, what happened to Spot? Or maybe you want to co-write or write in a shared world with other authors, and more than one person has to be on the same page about the story, the world, the characters, the rules, all that stuff. Collaboration is a really good reason to create a story Bible or a series Bible. Or you just don't want to waste time searching through your manuscript or manuscripts to find details about your character, like what was his eye color or her height, what they were wearing, what was her sister's name, what was the aunt's name that I mentioned in chapter 3. She has to come back in chapter 20. Do I remember? If I don't know what chapter it was, at some point in Act 1, I mentioned so-and-so's name, and now I have to find it. There's tons of reasons why you might want to keep really detailed records so that you don't have to search or read through your entire manuscript to find these details. This is where the story Bible comes in. So what are the elements of a story Bible? So I've broken this down into 7 parts, and they are a space to plan your book or your series, a space for characters, for groups, for the entire world and the world building details. And this is regardless of what genre you write, whether you're writing speculative fiction, sci-fi, fantasy, or contemporary, historical, our world. You're still doing world building, and the Story Bible is a great place to keep all of those details. Your timeline and events, the places and locations, and then if you are doing some sort of speculative fiction, then magic or technology if you are into science fiction. So the first section of the Story Bible is for planning. Now, these are the elements that I like to put into my Story Bibles, and I recommend them for other people, but this is obviously, you're going to customize it to your own needs to be exactly the way that you want it to be. So I'm just outlining the things that I do, the things that I recommend. Take what you will from this and add, remove as you need to. So a vision statement. I always start my books with a vision statement, and I go through this process in the Story Seed workbook that I have. It's a mini course that I offer in terms of how do you start with a new project idea? How do you get to the point where you're ready to write? Before you even start plotting, there's several stages that I've learned to do over the course of writing almost a dozen novels and novellas that includes this vision statement. So it means, what do you want the story to be? So it can include the themes you want to explore, a belief about the world that your story promotes or exemplifies. I use the vision statement to help keep me grounded. And whenever I have problems with the story, like I get to the midpoint usually and things start to fall apart, my carefully plotted story just isn't so carefully plotted anymore, and I've had to change a bunch of things, and I get down on myself, I come back to this vision statement. It's like, what did I imagine the story could be? And what am I really, why am I writing this in the first place? So that's in the Story Bible. The logline and the blurb, so doing those up front, wherever you do them in the process, whether you do them before you start writing, which is a good technique to organize your ideas, or if you do them at the end when you're ready to hit publish, you're going to need a place to put them. So your logline is usually a brief 1 to 2 sentence summary of the story, and the blurb is the back cover copy. It's the short description of the book that you'll put on Amazon and the various retailers and the back of the paperback. Also, my outline goes in the planning section of the Story Bible. I'm a plotter, so I have an outline, I have a synopsis, I have lots of upfront materials that I need to gather and refer to during the writing process. And sometimes afterwards, like if the book has been on the shelf for a couple of years and, I need to refresh myself, maybe I'm going to do an interview or a talk about it. And, once the book is on the shelf, I forget all about it. I can't tell you the plots of certain books, especially when you write a lot of them. So you can refresh yourself with your whatever materials you use. Even if you're not a plotter, there might be something that you have outlined ahead of time, or just notes that you might have, bullet points, whatever. I put the synopsis in, so I go from my outline to the full synopsis. I also keep a file of questions that I gather and compile during the writing process. So when I come to something that I don't know and I want to keep moving and not get stuck, often because I have a deadline or getting stuck is it's a part of the process that, depending on what stage you're at, like when I'm at the beginning and I'm doing my first draft, I don't need to know all the details. I'm telling myself the story. It's revealing itself to me as I write it, even though I have a plot. So I keep just a bullet-pointed list of questions of what I don't know about the story, the characters, and the world. And then later on, future me will have to go and answer these questions and figure this stuff out. I make a to-do list of things that I want to come back to. So it might not be a question. It might just be like a research note. Like, I know that I have to look into the architecture of castles, if they're going to build a new wing, what material would they use, or whatever world building thing or character issue. It could be anything. There's just the to-do list so that I can keep my forward momentum and have one place to go to keep track of all these things that I know I want to do later. I also keep a list of characters. So there's different character section. There's a whole character section that we're going to talk about. But in this planning section of the Story Bible, I keep just a bulleted list of the characters that I can refer to quickly. So this does not include pictures, bio, height, weight, anything. It's just the character name and maybe a little bit about who they are. So, if it's so-and-so's cousin or mother or best friend, just as a reminder of who they are. And then I'll go into more detail in the actual character section with the full character profiles. So this is the next section. We go to the character section where we have these character profiles, where I keep all of the information, as much detail as I feel I need to know who the character is, things that I actually write, or even if it doesn't end up on the page in the book, these are the details of the character. So it includes their basic information, like their name, age, height, weight, eye and hair color, maybe their job, things like that. Personality, I do a lot of character work at different parts of the writing process. So this might not be a first draft activity. This might be a final draft activity, or right before the final draft. I'll go in and do a lot more character work, but sometimes I do it up front. And this can include their characteristics, like their positive and negative traits, the Myers-Briggs of it all. I use Enneagrams, which is another kind of personality typing system. So there's also archetypes. There's various methods of creating personality types that can be useful when you're creating characters. So that information goes in there and a little description about what that means. Maybe you use their sign, in Aries, and this is the particular part of Aries that they are. Or if they're an Enneagram type 8 and that's a challenger and they're going to have these qualities, that goes there. Backstory, so personal history, wounding events, timelines. If I do a little first person character sketch, which I do sometimes for certain characters, usually main characters, and regardless of what perspective the book is in, even if it's in third person, I might try to get into the character's mind and just write a first person scene from some period in their history that is not even in the book. It's just a pivotal scene in their growth. Often it's the wounding scene, and that comes from the idea that characters have wounds. Lots of different character theories have that idea. I might put their timeline, so their birth date, their death date, if they die, but the time that specific actions have happened to them, and then their relationships, how they relate to other characters. So whether it's familial, friend, enemy, if they never meet another character, that kind of stuff gets recorded. Groups is the next section of the Story Bible. Now, groups is something that's flexible, and it really depends on the type of story and the genre. In fantasy, I'm often writing about nations or races, or, if in other kinds of speculative fiction, it might be a planet or a species. It could just be an ethnic group. It could be a religion. It could be a club. Groups can be kind of anything. So depending on the type of group that you have, you may or may not need the bulleted items below on the slide. So if I'm dealing in nations in one of my secondary world epic fantasy stories, then I'm going to go into the climate and geography of that place, the social structure, the government and economics, all of the world building things happen there. Now, in the books where I'm writing in our world, more contemporary time period, I might not have, I'm not going to do the United States and their climate geography. I'm just going to have these shorthands that I know. But if it's taking place in another country that I'm not as familiar with, let's say I'm writing a story and they travel to Mozambique or something, then I'm going to have to do some research on customs, maybe the government, maybe the economics, depending on what impacts my story, and put that stuff here. If it is a religious group, whether it's a real one or an invented one, I'm going to put the beliefs and the rituals. Maybe there's specific clothing that they wear. Like I have in my Earthsinger Chronicle series, there are this order called the Sisterhood. They are basically like, nuns, and they wear specific clothes, and they have specific customs and rituals. And I would also do this for my invented nations. And then even in a contemporary or a real world story, like I have a book, The Monsters We Defy, which takes place in our world in Washington, D.C. in 1925. I don't necessarily need the climate and geography of DC. I grew up right outside of DC, so I'm very familiar with the muggy swampness of it all. But I did have to do a lot of research into fashion and clothing for the 1920s, and also the art scene, the music scene of Washington, D.C. There were things that I wanted to bring to life in this real world community that required research. If I'm creating a brand new town, like the book that's coming out next year that I turned into my editor, I invented a fictional small town in the 1930s in the South, and I still had to go through a lot of the stuff. So what were they wearing in the 30s? What were common clothes? What is going to be unique to my town? Is it stuff that I'm creating out of whole cloth, or is it stuff that I've researched? All that stuff goes here. There's also like education, military, healthcare and medicine, family life. What does that look like? These are all the world building things that you need to do regardless of the type of world that you have. Because even if you're in our world, once again, you're still creating a space. You're creating a place that's fictionalized based on a real place. And you're going to adhere to certain norms. You're going to emphasize certain things. There are going to be certain people that are there, and maybe they're immigrants. Maybe you're going to deal with specific communities or specific age groups and fads, things like that. So the next section of the Story Bible is for the world, and it's another part of world building. And this and groups can kind of a little bit be interchangeable. It depends. This is why you customize it to your own story and your own world. But when I think of the world as opposed to a smaller group, like even if it's a nation or a city or a club or an ethnic group, the world that you're building is going to have specific things in it, regardless, once again, whether it's our real world or your invented world. So there's going to be plants and agriculture. You're going to have it be dependent upon the location. So Washington, D.C., it's going to have different plants and agriculture than Tempe, Arizona. Animals and creatures, if they're invented creatures, or if you are dealing with the buffalo, and you're writing something in the 1800s in the plains, keeping track of, where those characters or creatures are, where they come from, what are their habits, what do they eat, like how are you going to present them in the story? Food, what do people eat? Where does it come from? Do they hunt or fish? Are they getting it at the grocery store? Are they gardening? Religions, what do people believe in? All of these things can create conflict and all part of the rich tapestry of world building. And that's really what the Story Bible is about, keeping track of all of these details. Are there multiple religions, the customs, who are the adherents? So whereas in the group section, I might be focused on a specific group, here in the world, I'm listing out all of the religions that are at play potentially in the story. We go into language and lingo. So not just any conlang, constructed language that you might have in a speculative fiction story, but real world languages and also slang, phrases that they might use, names of places, names of towns, if you're creating something, how does things sound? What are people's names? How are they named? Are there naming conventions that you're using? Sports, games, and leisure, keeping track of what they do for fun and the pastimes and the names and rules of the games. Once again, whether it's American football or the rest of the world football, aka soccer, or some invented game that you have. Transportation. How do they get around? How fast can they travel? How do they communicate across distances? Is it just our world and they have cell phones, or is it something else? And is it a situation where you can create conflict where maybe a character loses their phone and there's no more payphones? And, these types of things can be important, once again, regardless of your world. So the technology in the story, are there scientists? Is there magical research? Where is the level? What year are you placing it in if it's our world? And if it's not our world, what is the level of technology present? And how does it impact your story? Also, timeline and events. So the history, what has happened up until now in your world, and how do these events affect your story? So for the Earthsinger Chronicles, Second World Fantasy, I did have to create about 500 years of history. I just did big picture things that people would talk about. I thought about, what do we talk about in history in our world? What were the big wars? What were the big disasters? What were the conflicts? And everything that I created in my invented history of my world was something that could potentially affect the events of the story. Now, in a non-speculative, realistic story, it can be similarly, it's still the history that affects your world. Like in The Monsters We Defy, it takes place in 1925 because there was an event in 1925 in DC that I wanted to have happen on the pages of my story. So I set it in that month so that I could reference that real life event, which happened to be a Klan march in Washington, DC. It's just a little tiny piece of the story, but that is part of the history. And researching the real life history allowed me to know what's going on in the story. And the calendar. I always have a calendar, regardless of, whether it's invented world or our world, just so I know, how long, over what period of time the story takes place. A good copy editor will be checking for this. They will be trying to see, okay, so 2 days ago was Tuesday, but today you just said it was Wednesday. So there's a mismatch there. In my secondary fantasy world, I actually invented new names for the days because obviously they wouldn't have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in this alternate world. I just went very easy and called it first day, second day, third day. But I know that, if you're doing fantasy or even sci-fi, there could be any number of ways that you decide to create your calendar. There are books where there's multiple moons and there's multiple months and days last for a week, because of the lunar cycle or whatever, like however you want to do it. And then there's places in magic. So you're keeping track of your locations, buildings, forests, landscapes, nations, planets, whatever it is, and describing them, things that you need in the story. Sometimes you might need a map of even a room. When you think about fantasy maps and these big locales, but often I need to diagram a room or the floor of a house so that I know where my characters are walking in space and time. And that can be something that you put in the story Bible and keep so that if you have to take a break from the story and you've forgotten the layout of the house, you come back to it. Hey, here's my little sketched out by hand map that I drew. It doesn't have to be fancy, especially if it's not going in the book. And of course, your magic system, if you are doing a story with magic in it, describing it, how it's important to the story, what are the rules, what are the consequences, what are the costs, all that stuff can be templatized and should be included in the story Bible. Another section for the story Bible should be research. So keeping track of your notes, sources, links, bibliographies in the story Bible is really important, especially if you're doing any kind of research that you might want to come back to later, or you just want to know where you got things from. Like there's a lot of transference that happens, and I find myself when I'm researching, I want to make sure that I'm not plagiarizing anything. So I take a lot of notes, but I always leave a source for where the note comes from so that in the future, I'll know. Once again, copy editors like to have this information. They will ask you questions if you have a good copy editor, double checking your facts. And if you can be like, hey, I know this is true because I can point you to the book or the website because I kept track of it. I didn't do this early on in writing my books. And it's something that I learned to do later because of copy editors. And because also when I would go back to something, a longer series and realize I said this, but now I'm not so sure if it's true. And I want to feel more confident that the research that I have, that I know where it came from and that I can update it if necessary, or that I at least can attribute a source if I ever need to. And then once I started writing historical fiction, I wanted to include an author's note because I love to have the author's notes, especially in historical fiction. All kinds of fiction can obviously have author's notes, but it's really fun to read where an author got their idea or information for a specific piece of history that might be surprising or intriguing. And so having that bibliography, keeping those sources as I'm doing the research is really important. And there's a variety of ways that can happen. Right now, I'm keeping all of my research in a program called Notion. I have done it in Scrivener, which is the program that I use to write my books. And there's other dedicated research software. If you've gone through a graduate degree, you might know of these other research and bibliography software that are specifically for that purpose. They might be overkill for the average writer, but there's lots of different ways to do it. You can just keep a text file. My very first version of this was a text file where I would just dump in quotes and links, and just keeping track of it is super important. So some of the techniques and tools that can be used to create your own story Bible or series Bible. What I use now is Scrivener. I keep a Scrivener file separate from my manuscript that is just for the story Bible. That's specifically when I'm doing a series. If I'm just doing a single book, a standalone, then I will just use one Scrivener file for the story Bible and the manuscript. That's one of the wonderful things about writing in Scrivener. It's so flexible. It's got these sections available for story Bible type stuff. For all these sections that I'm talking about, you can create them in Scrivener, and that's always a really great thing to do. There are templates available for Notion, which is another software which is more like a database. They call it a database software. It's hard to describe what Notion is. It's part database, part note-taking, part spreadsheety, but not quite. It's just a great all-around tool. If you're not familiar with it, there's lots of resources out there that will help you get started with Notion. I found it super helpful. I keep everything in Notion. I keep my author stuff from, planning my podcast to all of the links for my books, all of the by links, my bio, my author bio. I have a database of just notes that I take as I live my life, like things that I'm gathering. So yes, Notion is great, and it also can be great for a story Bible. The software Plotter can also be used. I've used it too as a story Bible, and there's another workshop at this conference on Plotter. I use lots of Plotter tools. I really like Plotter as well. And so sometimes it's a matter of trying out different things and seeing what works for you, what makes sense in your brain. I like to be very specific and really organized. I like having icons for things. So Notion and Scrivener work best for me for that. But if you're already using Plotter to plot your books, then sticking your story Bible there makes a lot of sense. Keeping the tools manageable, like not adding tools just to add them, unless that's your thing. Like sometimes that's my thing, and I like having a lot of tools, so no judgment. Other options for creating a story Bible are personal wiki software. I've tried that as well. And if you're more technical, that might be a thing you can do. There's personal wiki software like Wikipedia on your own computer, and then you can put it on your website, like in a folder on your server if you have a web server that allows for that. There's other specific software like Campfire and World Anvil that are used not just by writers, but by gamers and DMs and people like that. And then, of course, there's pen and paper. There is the old standby, which totally fine if that works for you. I do not like pen and paper, as I mentioned in the very beginning, because I like to be able to search my story Bible. I need to hit Command F and type in my character's name and find everywhere that it is. And then if I need to change the eye color quickly, or if just I have a question and I can't remember exactly where I put it in the story Bible, searching is so important. So I recommend some kind of digital system that you can use that and has search ability to make your life so much easier, that you can back up, that you're not going to forget at home in a big binder, or it's not going to be burned up in a fire, or you're not going to spill coffee on. That is very important to me, but some people are very tactile, and it works best to have just a 3-ring binder with dividers in it and a whole punched paper and that whole thing. So whatever works for you, as long as you have something that you can use to keep track of all of this information and keep yourself organized, that is the most important part. So part of my tips strategies and maintenance of your story Bible: update it regularly. So regularly can mean different things to different people. So as I'm writing, I'm usually changing my mind about things. I might have a character start out as a janitor, and then she becomes a secretary, and then she becomes a professor or whatever. So different drafts are going to have different iterations. And so sometimes updating your story Bible means updating it after each draft or after each decision. You have to pick a point that makes sense. You don't necessarily want to update everything every day because that's not efficient. But I would recommend scheduling a time to update it at different stages of the writing process so that you know if it's a situation where you know you're not going to make any more changes, where when you give it to your copy editor, you update the story Bible, you reread it one more time and go through and make all these notes. Having something in place that makes sense for you is super helpful, because there's nothing worse than having it be out of date, and then it's not helpful anymore. Organization is key so that you can find things. That is why I set up this workshop in the way that I do. I set it up in the way that the Story Bible works, with the different sections, so that I have an idea of where I can find certain things. And I set it up at the beginning when I'm creating my Scrivener file for a new book. If I know it's going to be a series, I make a separate file. If it's just one book for now, I will put it in the same document, make all my folders. I actually have a Scrivener template that I use and reuse and then update every so often when I decide to change my mind, or like when I started adding the vision statement to my books, I added that to my template. Use some kind of system that has templates. So Scrivener, Notion, Plotter, they're all templatized. World Anvil and Campfire, this software as well, have templates. I haven't used those software, but I tried the free trials of them. I just prefer sticking with Scrivener and not incurring an extra cost. But having the templates is really important. It simplifies things, especially as you do this more and more. Using a system that allows for cross-referencing. So one thing I love about Scrivener is that if I, create a character profile, then, or an object profile, let's say that there is a special talisman or a necklace or a book that has a specific name and gets an entry in the Story Bible somewhere, you can create document links within the separate files inside of Scrivener that allow you to click on it and say, you are saying so-and-so is married to somebody else. So you can click their spouse's name and that will take you directly to that spouse's profile. Or, my main character, Clara, has this ring. And the ring has an entire entry because it's a magical ring. And so in the character profile of Clara, I might list that this is one of her possessions. And then you click on it, you can go to the description and the entry for that item, which is part of my magical objects in my magic section of the Story Bible. So that cross-referencing just allows you to get places quickly and keep things organized. Backing up, just like any other digital file, you want to make sure it's backed up regularly. Scrivener is also wonderful for that. And when all else fails, you can outsource it. So there are people, sometimes editors or proofreaders, there are services that you can hire to create a story Bible or a series Bible if you do not feel like doing it yourself. If you're already in the middle of a 7-book series and you don't want to go back and do this, but you think it would be a good idea to have, then there are people that you can hire who will do this for you. And you pay them and they do it and they give it to you and it's all wonderful and lovely. So there's lots of ways that you can make it work for you, that you can customize it to your story, your genre, your world, your brain, just your preferences, all of that. And that's super important. And if you'd like to have a peek at what this looks like for me in my story Bible inside of Scrivener, this is my template. In note card view, you can see the different documents in my planning section. So they correspond to what we talked about, all of these different items. And then there is still the default space for the manuscript in Scrivener, which I would use if this was a standalone book. Here I have my character profiles, and these are characters from my novel, The Monsters We Defy, that I just brought in to give an example of, having the graphics and additional files in your character profile. Here is an example of a relationship of a character. So we're in the character of Israel, and he's one of my heist crew members. This is a heist story. And then we have Claire, a link to her profile, which opens up her profile over here, depending on how your Scrivener is set up. So that's really cool. We have sample groups and just information that you can fill in inside of the template on each of the groups. And the world, each item in the template has a different document where I can go in and put in information about these various things. If I wanted to, I could create individualized templates for all of these topics, but right now they're just blank in the blank template. There's a space for a calendar where you can have just a simple grid I set up depending on your needs, and how you want it to look. There's a template for places, and just another example of the linking feature that gives you relationships between different documents. I do have a magic system template that I use for creating new magic systems for my fantasy novels. And then there are the default Scrivener research, and this is actually where you can create additional templates in the templates folder that you can use for different pieces of information. So you can make your own structure inside of this program. And that's one of the reasons why I like it so much. So this template is actually available as part of my course, Imaginary World Building, Creating Fictional Worlds for Writers. And there's tons of resources in there for people who are creating worlds, regardless of whether it is in a speculative fiction realm, fantasy or sci-fi, or realistic fiction in our world. So I hope that you have gotten something out of this presentation. I hope that you've learned something. If you don't have a story Bible, I hope that you've been inspired to start your own. You can download the guide, which is a full PDF guide with all the information on the categories and the structure and some ideas for templates for your own story Bible. If you go to lpen.co/storybible, that document, the PDF download, will include a coupon for my full world building course, which is Imaginary World Building. And so, yeah, that is the information up there. And I will be available in the chat for questions. So if you have any questions, let me know there in the chat. And thanks so much for being here. And I hope that you have the best of luck creating your own story Bibles, and that it really simplifies and streamlines your writing process and the process of creating a series, or even if you're not doing a series, whatever your writing journey is and wherever it takes you. I know that a story Bible would be a great addition to your process. So thanks.